I see some familiar, friendly faces. I also see some new faces. So I'm deeply honored by all of you coming out tonight to have some discussion around what I think is one of the most brilliant political theorists I've encountered really at any time. And I study political theory from ancient Egypt to present day. And I think Hannah Arendt is an undersung hero of political theory in my mind, and I hope you will agree. There's actually, oddly enough, in the series, we've got two presentations on Arendt this time. Dr. Carmen will be talking about the banality of evil. I believe it's on Wednesday night. I don't know. It'll be on the slide at the end. And that's the subtitle for one of her books, Eichmann in Jerusalem. And she's just got such a profound mind, and it's driven because it merges experience and theory all at once. She's lived through this. She's not just looking at these things from outside. She's seen how this works, and sort of, even though she's not with us anymore, she passed away in 1975, she really offers us, I think, a glimpse into what we need to be always vigilant about, right? So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. I actually did this talk for Holocaust Awareness Week, or a similar talk to this. I think it had a similar title. I've added more to this, so we'll see how that all goes. But that came out in the spring of 2020. We actually did the Holocaust. Was it 2021 that we did this? But everybody was still masked up. You might have remembered there was some sort of a pandemic thing going on. And so I never did see my audience. I did it in front of a green screen over in the studio, and so it's kind of archived somewhere in the annals of history. So I'm so excited to have you all back here as a live audience. I think it's as relevant as it was in 2021, and it's certainly important for us to talk about. So, without further introduction, those of you that don't know me, though, by the way, I am a professor of political science. I came here in 1996 to start my academic career, and I love this place. So I'm going to continue my academic career here until they kick me out or I retire. The latter seems to be probably much further on than the former, so we'll see what tonight goes like. I thank my trustees for coming out as well, so I guess I'll find out after this talk whether I still have a place here at CMU. But it's been my great honor to teach in this building and on this campus forever. And so let's get started. I want to introduce you, thank you. I want to introduce you to, look at that, I already brought a fan. Hannah Arendt. This is just the most classic picture of Hannah Arendt. It's got kind of a bit of her spice to it as well. Hannah was born in Hanover, Germany, in 1906. She lived through World War I as a young child in Germany. So there was watching family members, watching members of her society, maybe not understanding entirely, right? Because she might not have. World War I is what was over when 1918. She would have been 12. Yeah, no, yeah, 12. So early but formative, right? And then an important period of time in German history. Should make another quick biographic note. I'm the son of a historian. That's why I pay attention to history all the time, right? This was my childhood, not Hannah particularly, but the Weimar Republic, oddly enough, was a bedtime story for us. So it's the Weimar Republic, if you're not familiar with it, was an interwar period of time, and it was a democracy in Germany. It wasn't a perfect democracy by any means, but it's important for us to contextualize, and it certainly is for Arendt, to contextualize that the fascism that grew out, the totalitarian state that grew out of the end of the Weimar Republic that we now know as Nazi Germany, that we blame for World War II and all of that, it grew out of a democratic system. And so I think this is why she was so driven to write this story. But as you'll see in a few moments, this story is not just a story about Nazi Germany. This book is also the story of the Soviet Union and the rise of Stalinism. So you've got extreme left and you've got extreme right, and guess what? They both can lead to totalitarianism. So it's important for us to understand what it is. What are the conditions that create this space? Because maybe, just maybe, we don't want to have to go through that again, right? All those cliches about those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. I don't know if that's true. History, you know, what do they say? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, you know, this sort of thing, right? So it's valuable not just in this moment, in every moment that we have as a democracy. We cannot assume that, oh, totalitarianism is something that Germans do or something that Russians do, because we all know those Russians, they're very aggressive people, right? We grew up in the Cold War, we know nothing about Russians, but we know everything about Russians, right? Because they were defined as the opposite of us, right? This godless communist masses that don't really even understand how to do a market well, right? These are the problems. So Hannah Arendt, it's also important to note that she grew up in Germany as a Jew. And in those interwar years, there was strong anti-Semitism. Again, this doesn't start with Hitler, and she makes this point so clear that anti-Semitism is actually a long attitude within Europe. She actually quibbles over this notion. She puts it in the 19th century, and things that happened before that were anti-Jewish, but not necessarily anti-Semitic. We probably don't need to get into all the details. Read the book. But suffices to say, this scapegoating is a part of where it starts, right? So we do Holocaust awareness. I do Holocaust awareness, not quite every year anymore. I used to do it every year, and now it's most years or some years. Anyway, I commit to this project because I think it's really important for not only for us to not forget the Holocaust, but to learn the lessons so that we don't have to go through that again in other places. And I was one of the ones that kept pushing the boundary into other genocides, right? So we talked about Rwanda, and we talked about all kinds of things. So I used to do films. Now I'm doing lectures. Maybe I should go back to films. Time will tell, right? Hannah Arendt fled Germany early, 1933, early in the sense that she did not have to deal with the full onslaught of concentration camps and those kinds of things, but definitely persecution, definitely scapegoating, definitely it was clear to anybody that was looking at the analysis, this is not going in the right direction, and maybe it would be safer for me to get out of Germany. So she came to the United States, ultimately ending up in New York. When we were still accepting Jews, later we chose not to accept a lot of Jews that were fleeing from the Holocaust, but at least at that point, a Jewish scholar, a person who beyond, you know, whatever visa we have that says if you're bright and ambitious, you can come work here, that sort of thing. And she came and she taught at some of these secondary perhaps to CMU, but there's like Princeton, Berkeley, Chicago, right? Maybe the New School in New York, which if you don't know the New School in New York, it's a pretty famous one too. It's just famous in different circles perhaps. She was author of numerous books. Eichmann in Jerusalem, as I mentioned before. My colleague Colin Carmen is going to be talking about that in a couple of nights. The Human Condition. It's an awesome political theory book as well, trying to broaden this out. But this book tonight that we're going to focus on, in 1951, The Origins of Totalitarianism, is really a cautionary tale. It helps us to understand analytically how this comes about. And just a hint, it's not because Germans or Russians are crazy, okay? There are mechanisms and steps that make it somewhat difficult if you're not paying attention to be able to maneuver later, right? There were plenty of Germans, even in later Germany, that were interested in going a different path, but had kind of lost their institutional ability to change that course, right? So remember this, if you remember nothing else, Hitler was elected, okay? His party was the party in power, and therefore in a parliamentary system he became the chancellor, right? And so he was elected to his own district, but he became the chancellor of all of Germany, and then proceeded to change the institutions in Germany in a wide variety of ways we'll talk about, so that it was difficult for Germans of conscience to resist over time. That's the story I think Hannah Arendt wants to tell us. She died in New York in 1975. Let's talk a little bit about this book initially. It's really a study of the rise of the new political movements, which she argues are very characteristic of the 20th century, right? That this kind of totalitarianism might not have been possible in earlier ages, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Part of it has to do with technologies and the way in which you can monopolize the conversations, right? And so we'll come back to that. She's interested in conditions that allow for totalitarianism. She is not trying to make a causal argument that suggests that if you do this, this, and this, you're going to immediately end up in a totalitarian regime. She's making the argument here that there are certain conditions that make it more possible for you to slip and one day wake up saying, my goodness, it quacks and it waddles. I think it's a duck, right? I think we're now in totalitarianism. As I mentioned before, she looks at both Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. I think it's one of the more interesting aspects of this book is that she didn't write the book, even though clearly, as a German Jew who saw all of what happened in the Holocaust by 1951, she had every right to write about how terrible this was, what this was, and how this happened in her own home country. But she wanted to remind us and added the Stalin piece because she saw this as endemic of a strategy of leadership and not or a strategy of social organization, and not necessarily something that was specifically German or specifically Hitler. And a lot of times people are like, well, it's Hitler. If only Hitler wasn't here, we wouldn't have done that. And I think Arendt would have said, if it weren't Hitler, given the conditions, it certainly could have been somebody else, right? So you do not have to be Hitler to start a totalitarian regime, right? His sort of megalomania might have helped in some ways, right? But it's not necessary. This is arguably, maybe not anymore, but at the time it was written, was the most in-depth study of the rise of anti-Semitism in the 19th and 20th centuries in Germany. And really, also something that gets lost because people see the title and they know it's about Nazis, so they know there's anti-Semitism and they know there's conversations about totalitarianism, but they miss part 2. Students always miss this, right? Because they read the beginning, they read the end, and they think, oh, I got the conclusion, I know what it is. Part 2 is really important too, and that has to do with global imperialism and imperial attitudes that arose in the 19th and 20th century that also help set the stage. So let's dive into this a little bit. There are 3 sections, as I mentioned. I will come back to some of these points in greater detail in a moment to talk about the mechanisms, right? But we start with anti-Semitism. There are historical roots to anti-Semitism. The Jews became the scapegoat of not just Germany, but of 19th and 20th century Europe. It's rooted actually in earlier scapegoating. And this is the argument that Arendt advances. She says that Jews were in a particularly vulnerable position because they often were wealthy, not exclusively, but often were wealthy, but almost to a person politically very powerless. They were a small minority that had always been blamed for the problems, that have been misunderstood because the majority of the populations were Christian, didn't necessarily understand them very well, and in fact many Christians even at that time, even to this day, are blaming Jews for killing Christ. And so probably not going to be high on the list of, I need to get to know what really motivates you since you killed my Lord and Savior. That kind of an attitude made it very challenging for Jews to be able to position themselves well. Populist appeal. This is also, I think, a particularly important thing is that the masses, so populism, just as a quick aside, some of you have taken my political science, very few of you perhaps, but my political science 151 class, we talk about populism. The thing about populism that makes it work, whether it's left or right, doesn't matter. It's basically the masses against some sort of corrupt elite, right? And so in this case, Hitler was able to, and actually Stalin to a certain extent as well, were able to highlight that the Jews were this corrupt cabal. Does this sound slightly familiar? Because you hear this all the time. Jews are controlling our media. Jews are controlling this, that, or the other thing, right? So there's a sense in which this small group of people is against the mass of people, however that's constructed and defined, right? And whether that small group of people is bureaucrats or socialists or Jews or whatever the group happens to be, they're portrayed as being in a position of elite power, which allows you to tap all of the rhetoric and the emotional response of populism, which is pretty important. It becomes essentially this notion of anti-Semitism, which has just been stirring kind of quietly, not like everybody was out marching all the time, saying, where can we find them? But it becomes weaponized as a tool for mass mobilization by saying, see this small group? They're actually kind of wealthy and they're super powerful, and they're the ones that are screwing up your life, right? For whatever reason, they're the ones to blame. And so people buy into this. Just quickly on imperialism, so much more to cover on imperialism, but I think because this is Holocaust awareness and people are interested in the totalitarian conversation, we'll just have this part of the slide. In the late 19th century, she makes the argument that the nation state itself was disintegrating, partly because of mixed populations, right? And so instead of, I mean, you had a lot of emigration, so you had a lot of people moving around between nations, and that, or migration, emigration, immigration, I guess. Immigration is coming in, emigration is leaving, migration is the word for all of it, right? So there's a lot of migration that's moving nations around, and nations were having a hard time maintaining, we're Polish. Here's Poland, we all speak Polish, we're all Roman Catholic, we all eat the same stuff. Here's what Polish means, because things were changing. Populations were moving around. It's part of that globalization thing, right? And so, because trade was starting to move, and goods and services. And so what happens is nations have to project a sense of nationalism, and they can't do it just by saying, we're all Swedish here, we're all Finnish here, right? It was harder to do that in England and France and so forth. And so they projected it by saying, we all live in France, different people, lesser people, people who deserve to be led by us instead of actually being our equals, live in these colonies that we have, right? And so colonialism allows racism, allows a racial hierarchy, maybe not racism as in I hate every person that comes from Africa, but racism in the sense that Africa clearly can't rule itself. They're not capable. They're not powerful enough. They don't really worry about these things like we worry about these things, right? And so they use imperialism or the over there, overseas, foreign aid kinds of things to say, that's not us. We're us, that's them. And that us-them dichotomy is really important for Arendt in terms of building this sort of thing, right? It introduces racism and also bureaucracy as dominant ideological tools. Not that bureaucracy was invented for imperialism, but she makes a pretty coherent argument. And again, by the way, here's the book to scare all the students in the room away, okay? It is a good read, though. She makes these arguments, fleshes these out, and I'd encourage you all to read this if you want to follow these arguments more. She's essentially making the argument that bureaucracy was a way of managing populations, and it's still used in that way. Now, you might say to yourself, well, Hitler didn't seem to follow rules. Isn't bureaucracy about rules? What Hitler did was utilize bureaucracy to systematically, and again, Colin will fill you in on this, in a banal way, in a very ordinary way. I'm just loading people onto cars. That's all I'm doing. I'm not sending them I don't know where they're going. It doesn't really matter because that's not my agency of expertise, right? That's somebody else's problem. And then somebody else down the road's like, well, I don't know where they came from, but they're now getting off and getting into showers, and so on and so forth. So bureaucracy was used to systematically move people around. And we did this in Imperialism as well. And that sense that some people are superior to other people, which is inherent, Arendt argues, in the concept of imperialism, in the concept of saying we should dominate these other countries are not our equals, right? That normalizes this conversation about once you begin to start down the path of Vince is less human than I am. I'm going to pick on Vince because if I start pointing on other people, I'm going to get in trouble. So I'll pick on Vince where it's obvious. No, I'm kidding. Anyway, but once I start thinking about Vince as less human, then I don't need to worry about the same rules, rights, obligations to Vince, right? And that starts us down the path. And that path can lead to some very dark places, right? And so if at some point down the road, well, we all know, like Vince and his kids, and he's not going to pass on those genes very well. We are the ones that have been ruling the world for so long. Surely these kind of people, sometimes they're just a liability, right? And then that puts you in a space, again, I'm hoping not anybody in this room, but that puts you in a space where you can invite them into this special chamber they might never actually walk out of, right? Because it's like putting your dog down. I mean, I'm sorry for those of you that love your dogs. I love my dogs too. I don't actually have dogs anymore, but I never put them down when I wanted to, perhaps. But the thought that they're somehow not me allows me to do that. If I wanted to put one of my daughters down because they got a little uppity, they're drawing too much on the family line of work or whatever, I'd go to jail, wouldn't I? Right? Because the dog is not a human. And that's the point of this kind of imperial racism, right? Is that we begin to do that. And they also got really, really good at dealing with violence, reacting, allowing them to rule by terror, which I'll explain here in a moment what I mean by that. Finally, there's the third section, which is where we're going to spend most of our time tonight, and that is totalitarianism. The 20th century cases, as I mentioned before, the dominant characteristic of totalitarianism, according to Hannah Arendt in this book, is terror. What is terror? Terror is your randomness about it. You just don't know when it's going to hit, right? You just don't know. You look for rationality, you look for logic in these things, you try as hard as you can to say, but I don't want to just call him crazy, so surely, but we don't really know. And when you cannot control your own destiny anymore because you're terrorized, whether it's like a formal process of, I don't know if I can walk into this building without it blowing up, or am I going to get on this plane? Will this plane crash? To, do I go to work and will my swipe card work, right? That's living in terror. And that's the principal tool for totalitarianism, because you upset people in a way that they cannot explain and that it defies their rationality, and that is the challenge, right? At least this is the argument. The unpredictable, seemingly random use of power eliminates our own individual spontaneity and creates what she calls superfluous people. We'll dig deeper in a minute. Also, the tools that are also employed, and these are tools we're going to do a slide on each because a good professor does a little foreshadowing before you get a slide with a little more depth. Time to take notes now. Mass mobilization, propaganda, and isolation, so that they can dominate all aspects of life. She's really clear about this in her book. Authoritarianism, usually tends to stop in the political sphere. Totalitarianism wants to dominate all aspects of your life, okay? They want, and that doesn't mean necessarily that they're always watching you, but if you're fearful your neighbors might turn you in, if you're fearful your family members might turn you in, if you're fearful that somebody will find out what you've been browsing on. She didn't talk about browsers, just to be clear, but you get the idea, right? Somebody will intercept your letter in which you talk about your concerns about the government, and so you just simply don't send that letter to a family member, or don't bring up those conversations because it's uncomfortable, because those conversations might lead to, maybe somebody will read that wrong. I don't know. I'm a professor. I talk in front of 40 students. I think this week we're going to be talking about Islamism in my class, right? Who knows who I'm going to irritate or upset with that? And if I was a smart professor under a totalitarian world, I would self-police. And that's an important part of totalitarianism as well. You don't need, as another theorist had put it, you don't need the boot stomping on the face forever. In fact, that is incredibly hard for the social system to maintain. We notice when you're cracking our heads on a regular basis with nightsticks. If you get us to voluntarily participate in the self-disciplining that happens because of the terror, because I just never know when I'm going to get caught. And if I get caught, it's going to be very, very bad. I just know that, right? If I get on the wrong side of Hitler, if I get on the wrong side of Stalin, I'm going to end up in a gulag somewhere in Siberia, and I'll look forward to and envy those that die early from the cold, because I probably, knowing my dumb luck, would last a long time in Siberia, so I could suffer every single day. I got to trade that off against feeling like I can express myself, feeling like I want to stand out. That's what she means by this individual spontaneity. You do not want to stand out. As one of my students put it, you don't want to be the tallest nail when the hammer comes around, because you're the one that gets hit first. And that logic, so to speak, of terror is what drives totalitarianism. People go willingly into this sort of thing. Small talk in a police state. How you doing? Oh, I can't complain. Ba-dum-bum. Okay, never mind. What's different, as I mentioned, it's not just domination or authority, but total control. And that's intellectual control, so we worry about what we think about, we worry about what we believe, we worry about what we do in our own private spaces, right? And in America, we think private space is only what happens in the bedroom. That is generally private, but there are other private conversations that we have outside the bedroom with people that we're not sleeping with, and those are important too, right, in terms of this whole sort of question. It's a lack of distinction between this public and private realm, right? I mentioned terror on enemies, but also on disloyal supporters. I should point that out too, because we tend to think of totalitarians like Hitler as scaring Jewish people who live in Germany or in Poland or in any country in Europe, and indeed, I suspect he did scare them quite a bit. But he also scared Germans into behaving the way he would like. They were afraid that they were going to lose their privileged position. They were afraid that they would no longer be professors at a university. They were afraid that they were no longer going to be financial powers. They were afraid they weren't going to have access to the courts and that sort of thing, which would make it hard for them to do their job. These are the ways you actually use terror on everybody, not just the people that you name as those scapegoats, right? When we begin to all start living in that way, that's dangerous. Totalitarianism, she argues, also destroys traditions, right? It replaces all social, legal, and political traditions, maybe not all at once, slowly but surely, methodically, trying to work through those nodes of power, those nodes of opportunity that people have to resist it until there is literally no way left to resist, not just in terms of gathering, but even within our own mind, we think resistance is futile, right? Isn't that kind of what Star Wars is all about, right? The Empire is there, and look at the Death Star, and if you resist, you're going, that's the idea, right? So there are new institutions. Often those new institutions serve those goals. So it is not fundamentally conservative in the classic sense in which conservatives generally like institutions. They generally kind of support institutions. They generally think we'll go off the rails if we don't have guidelines like church or state or schools or whatever it is to kind of keep us moving all in the same direction, right? And while they may claim to be conservative, or they could claim to be, radically left, either way, they're destroying institutions. Also, a characteristic of totalitarianism is that it tends to subvert traditional channels of power and rely on mass movements as a base of support, rather than traditional elite structures. Elites can change their mind. The masses you can shape. You shape partly by terror, you shape partly by propaganda, you shape it by a variety of ways that allow you to have a much bigger base to hit people with. And people start to fear that base that you have, your connection with the masses. Now that doesn't mean that every politician that connects with the masses is automatically on their road to totalitarianism. I think we've tried to point that out. These are not necessarily just causal, but they create the conditions, right? And it's up to the individual to take advantage of that. Also, and this is really important for Arendt, and I think maybe even more important in our contemporary times. Again, she's writing this in 1951. She's writing about the 30s and 40s in Germany. There are, and in Russia as well. There are technologies that are new to the 20th century. Visual technologies are important in this regard. They tap into us in a way that the radio still doesn't quite do. And the radio is still quite important, taps into us in a way that newspapers do not. And so I can't channel my inner Arendt, though I'll probably do it at least 4 times this evening. But if I were channeling my inner Arendt, I would say she might not have been super thrilled at the possibility of all of us being completely linked. At all times, checking your phones. Maybe some of you are even doing that at this conversation. She also suggests that the concentration camps, right? And this is not necessarily, it doesn't have to look like Buchenwald. It doesn't have to look like Auschwitz. But they're a tool used to completely erase the humanity of the people you send there. They are isolated, they're separated from everybody else, they disappear, and over time you forget they were even around, right? And if you gave it too much thought, you'd say, maybe we're better off without them anyway, right? So that's the self-reinforcing idea. So concentration camps, she said, is not the only sign. So if you're saying, are we totalitarian now? I'm going to be asking that question towards the end, because that is part of the title of this conversation. Don't say, well, at least we don't have concentration camps, so I guess that means we're not. She would say that that was the culminating example of a tool that was used. And it wasn't used early on, it was used later in the process when the transformation of their societies became complete. It's actually used much earlier in Russia. The Soviets used concentration camps called the gulags much, much earlier. And again, they didn't always kill you. They didn't do like a mass extermination. They just put you in the coldest place possible without any heat and then made you work 15, 18 hours a day in labor on like a half a slice of bread and some broth. It's a good way to kill you slowly, right? But in their mind, what did Russia have at its disposal? Tremendous space to be out of sight, out of mind. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. So what mechanisms drive totalitarian governments? We start with the destruction or marginalization of social institutions, especially those that might provide opportunities for groups to push back, right? Whatever those are. Those resistance to the regime demands. They might be educational institutions, they might be judiciaries, they might be the legislature eventually, they might be any number of nodes of points that aren't sanctioned by the regime to be official places. We're going to be social, right? Dee could tell you a lot more about that. Well, so could Brenda. Dee's a retired sociologist. Brenda's an active sociologist. Time will tell whether Brenda ends up in the same place. I don't know. But either of them would be able to tell you much better than I about this sort of need for social connection that people have. People want to socialize. So when you destroy those institutions, you have to give them something to replace them with, right? So you have a different sense of belonging. It's not like you're denying belonging, you're just changing what that belonging entails. Also transforming classes into masses, okay? So you take a sort of class grievance, so this works really, really well when you have huge income disparities, huge income inequalities, right? Or social inequalities on a number of different levels, because you sort of get that dynamic of something's happening to me, I'm working really hard and I'm not getting very far, and these other people that seem to be privileged in some way are getting way ahead of me, I'm now mad. But rather than do class-based analysis, although the Soviets did more of this class-based analysis, you manipulate them into mass movements. And then another very, very important, and maybe that's the reason we originally gather here to talk about Holocaust awareness, is that you create scapegoats. You demonize groups of people. In this case, it was anti-Semitism, but it was also imperialism, right? It was all those masses in what we now call the global south or the undeveloped world or whatever we would like to say, like we're developed and they want to be just like us. Wouldn't that be the case, right? They just want to be like us, right? As opposed to what they are. Racism becomes this justification, as I said, for imperialism, and ending resistance from any part of the planet becomes desirable. So imperialism is important because not only does it serve a function of hierarchies based largely on where you come from, but then those hierarchies, right, sort of justify trying to stop resistance, right? This is just colonial subjects getting uppity. They don't realize how good they have it. Have you heard that kind of comment before, right? And if we're not careful, we'll be just like them. I don't want to be like them. I like flush toilets. I'm a big fan of having windows in my house. Okay, I don't want that. What did you need me to do? Because whatever you're telling me, I'm going to avoid, like, you know, doing bucket showers. I don't want to go backwards, right? That's how the logic starts. Ultimately, this is pushed by propaganda. Now, I have to be careful about this word because I have yet to ever meet somebody that says they actually do propaganda. Have you noticed that? Propaganda is literally something somebody else always does, not me. What I do is truth, what they do is propaganda, clearly. Right? Whatever it is that they're saying is clearly propaganda, right? And so this idea that there's information that's trustable, this information that's not trustable, in fact, maybe even pushing non-trustable information, makes the average person who's not paying a whole lot of attention to all the nuance in all of this to go, well, I can't trust any of it. You have your news channel, I have my news channel. It's all the same, isn't it? Right? So propaganda undermines the notion that there is anything like objective truth about arguably anything. You've got your numbers, I've got my numbers, right? What do they call it? Lies, damn lies, and statistics. Right? That's kind of the gradation down. That kind of attitude makes people think, well, nobody's telling the truth, and those that are using empirical data like statistics, they must be the worst of all. Right? Lies, damn lies, and statistics. I know it rolls off the tongue. You might have even said it from time to time as you're watching. Please don't keep norming that notion. Statistics may not always be good, and I'm clearly not the guy to be making an empirical argument in favor of statistics, but I will tell you that for us to accept even a cliche that arguments rooted in evidence, whatever that evidence is, are clearly the most dishonest arguments, has done a huge service to set the conditions for future totalitarian states. Talked about the destruction of institutions. Let me just show you how you do that. First of all, you eliminate any kind of legal stability. This is all coming from Arendt's arguments. You reject conventional laws and tradition, replacing them with pseudo-scientific ideologies that claim to obey things like the law of nature, or this is what history has told us. Have you heard these kinds of arguments, right? This is what history has told us, or even this is common sense. Common sense is kind of an appeal to a mass who doesn't actually get to fact check you on that common sense because you've already assumed that we all would agree, and if you don't agree, it's because you don't have, wait for it, what? Common sense, clearly, right? So it's part of the challenge, right? It reduces institutional resistance to this ideology, and that's the first step. You also atomization of society. You isolate individuals by destroying social bonds. You get families to turn in other families. We talk about it all the time over Thanksgiving dinner, that uncle we no longer want to invite over. Boy, social media makes this easy, doesn't it? You don't even actually have to see or acknowledge the people you atomize because they're not in your algorithm. I just never worry about that kind of stuff, right? And we're always surprised when it's like, really? Where did the 30% that believes that come from? How did they come up with that, right? So sometimes you point to disloyal members of your community. Oh, as bad as it is to be a scapegoat, right? As bad as it is to be the target population, clearly would have been bad to be a Jew in Germany in the late 30s, clearly. It's also really bad for you if you became a traitor to the cause, right? We highlight that you used to be a believer and you no longer are, right? In Christianity, we would have called that apostasy, right? And we usually burned apostates at the stake. That's kind of how you deal with heretics and apostates and all those that seem like they were on your team until they weren't on your team, and so you take them out into a public square and you torch them, and then everybody on your team goes, noted, right? See how that works? It's terror, right? But we have better tools. Another argument that she makes is dynamic chaos. Again, it creates this sort of shapeless structure, competing institutions, fluctuating hierarchies. There's just unpredictability. That's just what it is. And what it encourages people to do then is abandon solidarity, abandon, which she will argue, as you'll see at the end, is the solution out, is we work together, right? Abandon that because I'm going to cut my better deal, right? I'm going to go talk to them. I've got an in. I know somebody in the regime. It'll be better for me. I can't really do much about the neighbors down the street that were being hauled away. I can't stand in front of that lorry. I'm just going to be swept up in the mess, and then I'll be a traitor, and then that'll be worse than everything for me, and I'll lose everything, and I can't do that. I'm afraid of doing that. Fear is absolutely critical to this whole thing, right? Terror and fear, you don't know, so you just let them go, one at a time, right? I could name a few departments on this campus that I might let go, right? I'm not going to say that. But in my mind, because I've read Arendt, I stand in solidarity with my colleagues, not because all faculty are equally wonderful, but because the moment I decide, well, we don't really need philosophy now, do we? They don't get jobs. All of a sudden, there goes that, there's only a couple of professors in philosophy, right? I mean, we wouldn't really miss philosophy very much, would we? The answer is yes, by the way. We would miss philosophy. Political science is a small program as well. No ideas, those of you that have power to get rid of it. So it undermines trust, it undermines accountability, we seek solutions. Finally, we eliminate plurality. We destroy diversity, spontaneity, reduces the individual to an instrument of the regime. We essentially become atomized and therefore replaceable, which means at the end of the day we're not loyal as a regime to anyone except perhaps the regime leader. Everybody else, they're dispensable. As long as they're here, we love you. But the moment you're not doing what the regime wants you to do, plug and play. We're like USB ports, right? As opposed to what those of you, I'm sorry for the students in here who only realize the words USB ports and nothing else. USB is universal something or other. I don't know what the SB stands for, right? But it's supposed to all fit no matter what, right? Okay. There used to come a time where we would carry around like 12 different cords and different things to try to fit into the machines to make it all work. We're plug and play now, which means your individuality goes away. That's what happens, especially if you're challenging or threatening that. The masses is also a really important element, this populism side of things. The masses are often citizens that feel left out of traditional political parties, right? This is what Arendt is telling us in 1951. Like if you feel like neither or none of the 7 parties in the Weimar Republic are representing you, no worries. There's a new party called the National Socialists. We got your back. There's a new party called the Communists. We've got your back in Russia. If you don't feel like anything else represents you, you're absolutely right, but we will, right? That's the thing. The masses are often ignored politically by parties because they're seen as too ignorant or too apathetic. Again, it's all in Arendt, right? It's really stunning, 1951. Just have to kind of keep reminding you of this sort of thing. We're in 51 right now. Actually, we're in 45, as she's describing, or 38. They're ignored politically by the parties. They're treated as superfluous, right? So the masses can be mobilized. And the way you mobilize the masses is with a charismatic leader. You give them a point of focus, somebody that will speak for all of them, that seems to say things that they would like to say but never really get to say, right? When economic challenges arise in particular, this is one of the most dangerous conditions for fascism, is economic depressions like Germany and like Russia after their respective wars, right? Stalin started a little bit earlier in Russia than Hitler did in Germany, but those interwar years were tough, tough, tough places to be in both Germany and in the Soviet Union. Also, time of rapid social transformation can create more conditions for a mass movement because, again, people feel left behind by that. They're fueled by distrust or a feeling of betrayal by traditional parties. They desire to follow a leader who articulates that concern. They resent intellectuals because the intellectuals are often blamed for there's a French word, anomie. People know what anomie is? Emile Durkheim is a great sociology theorist that talks about this. Anomie is your sense of alienation, your sense of being disconnected. Anomie. There's no person, no body, right? And so the masses assume that these intellectuals, it's their fault for pushing progress and learning, and it gets reinforced the more that you remind the masses that they're just dumb. Especially if they follow this, they're even dumber, right? And so we really can drive people further into a condition of totalitarianism by the way in which we respond to our fellow. Maybe I'm not a totalitarian, but maybe I support the totalitarian efforts inadvertently, right, by saying, well, people just need a college degree to make all this work out, right? They're just dumb rednecks, right? Okay, that attitude, which may feel very cathartic and wonderful from time to time, right, and may give you a justification for what appears to be their irrational behavior, also fuels this kind of conversation. The masses are formed when class membership breaks down and the individual is highly isolated within the society. This is Arendt. Scapegoats and traitors. Sorry, this is a lot. Heavy topic. I needed to warn you about that, right? There won't be any flashing or strobe light effects. So and there's clearly, and you'll be grateful for this, no nudity or anything like that up here either. So, okay. Scapegoats are necessary to divert anger of isolated individuals. People don't know how to channel that. This can be directed towards an other, whether that scapegoat is overseas, in colonies, or whether that scapegoat is some group within your society. Usually it's a small minority. Actually, it works better if it's a small minority because then people are unlikely to actually have an actual social experience with those folks, right? If you push all of the Jews into the ghettos, nobody ever meets Jews except other Jews, and there's only 2 or 5 or 7% of the population is Jews. I don't know who those people are. I don't know anything. I don't have any connections. I'm isolated. Take them away. If you think that will solve our problems, that's what we do. Your fear of being labeled traitor keeps members of the mass movement in place, compliant, willing to prove their loyalty by sacrificing anyone else in the movement or outside of the movement just so they don't get accused themselves, right? And that goes all the way down to the personal, right? That's your relationships. I'm unfriending you. I'm not talking to you anymore because if I seem to be associated with Bob Murphy back there, Lord knows that's a problem, right? We know what he's like, and you are his friend, so surely, and I'm like, okay, Bob, it's been great knowing you, Bob, but not that great. In fact, Bob always made me a little suspect, right? I was a little worried about what Bob's saying, and let me give you a few examples now. That's how it starts, right? It's the personal that we drop off. Fear of being labeled as other keeps members patrolling the boundary. So this is also very, very important, right? So for fear in Germany of being labeled a Jew or a Jew sympathizer, you might double down on wearing your Christianity on your sleeve, so to speak. Not literally on your sleeve, but you might double down on that idea, because clearly Christians aren't Jews. Everybody knows that, right? And so clearly I will show that I'm a good and loyal person, partly because I'm showing I'm not them, right? I'm not this immigrant crowd that just came over. I'm a couple generations in and a hardworking person, right? So I'm willing to sacrifice this new group that may even be ethnically the same as me because I'm going to make a distinction that will make sure that I don't get swept up in that conversation. And so sometimes your most loyal members of the mass movement, according to Arendt, are those that are vulnerable themselves, fearful that they'll be the next group that gets identified, right? And so not only are you willing to sacrifice whatever group has already been identified, but you're falling over yourself to show that your group belongs in the society, and usually that means erasing your individuality, your diversity, your pluralism, and celebrating some sort of grand sense of the nation, right? This one, direct quote out of the book, I've been paraphrasing a lot, but this one is just powerful. Their most conspicuous external character, is the demand for total, unrestricted, unconditional, unalterable loyalty to the individual member. This demand is made by the leader of the totalitarian movement. There is no space for deviation. You see that coming, you might want to run the other direction. Or maybe do other things we'll talk about. The isolated individual, for their part, cures their anomie, so to speak. They no longer feel like they don't belong, because for the first time in their lives, maybe they feel like they belong to something. They belong to this new mass movement, with a leader who can articulate that. It's the first time ever that they feel like they're respected, that people pay attention to them, that sort of thing. Now, they have already surrendered quite a bit in the process, but they don't think about it that way. They think about the sense that I'm desperate to belong somewhere, and I've never really felt like I belong, and now I do. And I'm not going to give that up to help somebody else whom I might suspect is already part of my problem to begin with, right? So we sever off. I can do without the arm, so to speak, right? Propaganda. I'm almost done with our tools, and then we'll get to our discussion. I'm sorry, I'm running a little bit, not quite late. I want to leave some time for discussion, so we're getting close. Charismatic leaders and propaganda. This is really a heavy emphasis, and those of you that are my students will immediately recognize I spend a lot of time talking about ethos, pathos, and logos in every political science class I teach. It's elements of this in every political decision. Ethos is the values that we base it on, pathos is the emotional connection that you have, and logos is the rationality and the logic, right? And in a totalitarian system, you drop a lot of the values, or you assume that they're all the same anyway, so they're not worth talking about. You try to steer clear from logic and the logos and that sort of thing because you're recreating that, and what you've got left is a heavy dose, pedal to the metal, with emotional response. It's about feelings. It's about how people feel. They didn't feel good before. You make them feel good about themselves, about their country, about whatever that is, and they're willing to support that. You can be critical of facts offered by other sources of information, so you start targeting those independent sources. You target universities, you target journalists, you target political parties, you target any other source of information that doesn't come from the movement and the leader. That is absolutely essential for being able to control the conversation, and controlling the conversation is what makes all this possible. You use a series of projections or predictions about the future to guide the movement towards an objective in the future. I have a dream. I'm going to put this over here. Apologies to Martin Luther King. But this idea that I have a vision, here's where we're going, here's what we want, we're going to do this again, right? The Third Reich will last for 1,000 years. Soviet Union, once the communism has taken over the world, once we no longer have competition from those outside agitators we'll call capitalists, then we can live. Anything short of that, because communism was not working very well in the 30s in the Soviet Union in terms of improving people's standard of life, we blame that on those other capitalists that are really trying to mess up this thing, right? So the chief qualification of a mass leader has become unending infallibility. He can never admit an error. It's a really important part of a totalitarian regime. You can't admit your errors. There she is again. See, sometimes you just have to directly quote these things, right? Totalitarian dictators announce their political intentions in the form of prophecy, right? I can see the future in a way you can't see the future, and trust me, you want my future and not their future, whoever they are, right? Propaganda for the masses becomes unquestionable truth and reality upon which there can't be different of opinions. Kind of like 2 + 2 is 4. Is that really open for debate in people's minds? I don't know, maybe in quantum physics, but generally sort of have like this building itself is kind of based on that arithmetic, right? I mean, like they designed the system, they didn't say, well, the walls will kind of stay up, we hope, right? I mean, they like measured these things to make this work, right? And so the belief is that what's coming out of the regime is that kind of rock solid truth, right? Like 2 + 2 is 4. And ultimately, she'd argue on page 374 of my copy, every functionary is not only appointed by the leader, but is his walking embodiment, and every order is supposed to emanate from the one ever-present source, the leader. So the charismatic leader plays an important role, not because it's all their idea, but because they become the focus of this movement that can carry out a totalitarian regime. One person, no matter how good they are not going to push a nation, a population, into totalitarianism. But a person can take advantage of the conditions that are already in place and push that nation closer. Mass identity, followers belonging to his or her nation. Don't know that there's a really good example of a female totalitarian, but I haven't given a lot of thought to it right now. So maybe it certainly could be her nation as well. So the most important thing for the movement is belonging to the movement, not the ideas. Focusing on political ideas, and this is where we're going to start shifting to a change of what do we do about these kinds of things, right? How do you, if you see signs coming, how do you do something about it? And one of the things she argues is we should be talking about ideas and not about identity per se, because the identity is a question of belonging, whereas the ideas, you can reject the idea and then you move on. You leave the movement because their argument is flawed, right? But if it's about belonging, right, there are no arguments regarding policy, it's only the emotional connection, right, then you can stay loyal because it's about how you feel. And as long as you're feeling good about this situation, you don't have to leave. So a politics of identity replaces a politics of argument and policy in this case. And the identity is belonging to whatever the nation is, the Aryan nation, the Soviet comrades, right? This idea that we're all part of the Soviet collective, whatever the case may be. You belong to the nation, whatever that's defined as. Allows the state to penetrate far beyond their traditional domain, right? It controls the internal dynamic of their identity. And the disruption that you see in the system creates this sense of isolation. It creates this, so in other words, it sort of primes the group and then you offer them a solution, right? Be a little bit like me cooking a great meal, my kids smell it, they love it, and I tell them, there's no food. There's no food at all. You're going to be going hungry and starving, right? Because your mother just won't offer you that food. But maybe I can find you something. Let me rummage around a little bit. And then I bring them the food that they're now craving because they feel that they've lost. And they say, Dad's the cool one in the family. Mom's the jerk, right? Not that I would encourage you to do this, but this is a really good way to create sort of tensions within your own family in this regard, right? So what is to be done? And then let's have a little bit of a discussion toward the end here. This graphic actually fits very well because the most important thing for Hannah Arendt is collective action. Action working together. She makes this argument even more convincingly in The Human Condition. She argues that individuals are never powerful. They are strong, perhaps, or not so strong, depending on the case. Power comes from acting together, right? And the example that I use is, I might be able to educate myself quite well, right? I can read, I can be a scholarly professor, I can do my research, I can do all that sort of thing, right? But the power comes in the dynamic of all my students that want to learn, right? That's where learning happens. I mean, I do a little bit, I increase my knowledge base and that sort of thing, but those of you that have been, and I know there are a few former professors in here or current professors in the room, you know that the power of your being able to do it has less to do, if you're honest, with your base knowledge, I gotta be careful, it's okay, has more to do with that class dynamic, right? I'm actually, now that I'm doing this, I'm having some serious PTSD because John Nisolowski and I taught here on the spring of 2020. We taught in this very classroom American Cultural Revolution, and we were jazzed about, we had great readings, we had great conversations between ourselves. I don't think the class was paying a ton of attention at that point, right? And we just kept walking away going, this is really good stuff. Why aren't they getting that, right? We were strong, we weren't powerful, right? Powerful, and that learning is if we had figured out, and this isn't against us, it's just kind of the way it worked with that class, right? The class needs to read the readings, they need to participate, they need to come ready to learn, and if they do that, and John and I come on our A game, right, this room transforms lives. If John and I come with our A game, and they haven't read a thing, and they're not all that interested, and they're just, like, I got to get to practice here pretty soon, and all of that sort of thing, we're not going to make much of a difference. Same content, same experience. So power, for Arendt, is working together. The goal of totalitarian regimes, then, is to disempower you by isolating you, by keeping you, pitting you against each other. So Arendt says we need to communicate. We need to talk to one another, even if we disagree, about matters that are meaningful to us collectively. Like, where are we going as a society? Is it right that we have people living on the streets in our society? Is it okay that we are invading some country? Is it good for us that we have cut off aid here or added aid over there or switched alliances or done whatever it is that we do? We don't have these conversations with each other. Oftentimes, we have those conversations only with a source of information, perhaps, right? We need to talk. We need to participate in the political realm. We need to have opinions, and we need to share them, right? So what totalitarian regimes thrive on is you retreating. Don't retreat. Engage. Talk to people, even if it's tough. Talk to people, even if you won't convince them, because the talking itself is going to help those people. It's going to help you too, because you end up like all of those fish that get organized, and then the big fish bully no longer is picking them off one at a time. The big fish bully is on the run. Spontaneity is also key. Arendt argues, and I don't have enough time to really get into the full depth of the argument, but she basically says that when you're unpredictable, it's harder for regimes to control you, right? If you do what they expect you to do, which is conform, turn in your neighbors, do all of that sort of thing, then you're easy to manipulate, right? When you do things that just are not predictable sometimes, that's important. Resistance, she argues, is not optional, it is essential to the human condition. Not just resistance because we don't like a regime. Resistance is important because it helps us to maintain our individuality. It helps us to maintain what it is that makes us diverse from each other, which is probably, she would argue, our real strength, right? That's what we need to be doing. So not resistance for resistance sakes. I did that when I was a teenager. I did it a lot when I was 2 years old, apparently. My mother would tell me, right, the terrible twos. I was all about resistance. But those of you that have studied human growth and development know that the terrible twos are absolutely essential for that kid to start developing identity, even though you want to toss them out the window. But remember, you can't do that because they're not your dog, right? So you have to just deal with that. And in fact, maybe you celebrate the fact that as much as they're saying no, no, no on things you know are actually really good for them, they're developing a sense of being human, the human condition, which is to say, I don't blindly go along with everything anyone says, not even the people I love, right? I need to be able to practice autonomy. I need to be able to practice individuality. So is totalitarianism on the rise in the 21st century? Here's our conversation. Right? I've been watching your faces, right? And you're all like, oh my God. And she said that too? And you're like, 1951, wow, okay. She could have been writing this book, perhaps. And not just in our country, right? This is on the rise in a lot of places because we have the conditions for it. We have global inequality, we have populations being isolated, we have imperial hierarchies, even though we're no longer formally, generally holding colonies, we still have an imperialist attitude towards a number of other populations, like literally anybody else on the other side of the world, right? And again, that's not just the US, a lot of countries are doing this, You look at what Europe did with the immigration that came out of Syria and the breakdown of Syria, and they're like, not here, not there, go to Hungary. Oh, no, you don't want to go to Hungary. You go to Macedonia. No, you don't want to go to Macedonia. How about Italy? They're friendly. No, they're not. How about Spain, right? And all of a sudden, everybody's like, not us, we're not going to take you, right? So, first we need to move beyond name-calling. I think this is really important. We tend to project. We tend to do partisanship. We tend to do propaganda. What other people do is wrong. What we do is okay. Our team is good. Their team is bad. Remember what I said about resistance in the human condition? Your team is not always good. I hate to tell you that. And if you start with that assumption that the people I agree with may still not be right about this question, then you have a position that can resist totalitarianism. Because even though you love them, even though you may try to convince them, maybe you don't, but you engage them, right? But you don't just surrender your identity to another group of people, according to Arendt. You ground your analysis in evidence, criteria, look at past studies. This is a past study. So if you want to worry about whether totalitarianism, don't just say, I don't like that guy, I didn't vote for him, so he must be a fascist. Okay, you could get some evidence in the past to decide whether fascism, totalitarianism exists, but don't just toss out a label because he reminds me of Hitler. A lot of people remind you of Hitler, right? Education and examples. Learn to see the signs and learn to name them, right? So you don't say this is clearly it's a totalitarian regime. You say, that's a condition, we don't want to keep going down that road, because that's going to make us more susceptible. And the thing about Nazi Germany and about Stalinist Russia that Arendt points out is that they don't know when they're too far, right? You pass that threshold, there's no going back, but it may be a year or two before you realize that we should have turned left back there, kind of like when you're following Google Maps sometimes, and it's like, oh, we should have turned back there, half an hour ago, and now we are really lost, right? Not a good time to figure out that you're lost, right? Name these things along the way, right? Not that this person is a totalitarian dictator, but the actions that they're doing predispose us to totalitarianism more than we have been, and maybe that's not the direction we want. Unless, of course, there's budding totalitarians in here. I'm not asking for a hand show at this point. You know who you are, okay? You've been recording me all along. I'll be seeing you later, somewhere from Siberia, whatever it might be. Are these conditions arise? Is there antisemitism? Or is there scapegoating of any kind? It does not, again, have to be that particular group. Like, oh, well, don't worry, because they're friendly to Jews. So surely that means that they're not actually totalitarian. You got to dislike Jews. That's the gateway in. No, you have to scapegoat people. Small minority groups that are politically powerless and easy to pick off, those are the groups, right? Whoever you want to name them. Is there imperialism? Is there racial and national hierarchies and a desire to dominate others? Is there a totalitarian appeal, like a charismatic leader, propaganda, questioned source of truth, mass movement of disaffected populations, fear and terror? Again, the more times you check yes to these conversations, probably the further along down the road you might be. But Arendt died, I think, an optimist. I think her Human Condition is another book. I know I've already put this book on your reading list, so get a lot of time and add Human Condition on there as well, because I think they're really two parts of the same story. What she does in Origins of Totalitarianism is she tells us this is the danger inherent in human organizations sometimes, especially in the 20th and 21st century. With the technologies that we have, we will all face these things, no matter how secured we had originally thought ourselves to be. But She's optimistic about the human condition, and she believes that when we work together, you transform things, right? You have power, but only power together. I was actually quoting Arendt when we were debating the values at CMU, and I think I was lost on most of the people in the committee that wished we were moving on from this conversation, but I'm like, this is really important. Power, as defined here, is not domination. Power is about working together. Power is about our collective power as a faculty, as a staff, as students. That's when we can be proud of a value of power, because we're using it to collectively work, right? To try, even though we can be individuals, it's not overwhelming. Crisis is another one of those things. Are we seeing signs of resentment around the world? Are we seeing economic crisis? Are we seeing identity crisis? Rapid social transformation? Again, conditions, 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 people. So, I've been talking a lot. We should start having a conversation, and I apologize that it's been so long. There's just so much in this book. But I would love to hear some questions about these kinds of things or others, some reactions, some responses. We've got, we'll call it 10 minutes.
Yeah, I've actually had one that I've been thinking about that has to do with crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, when we think about the 1930s with the Great Depression, for example, right, or we even think about the early part of the 1920s where there's all of that
Sure.
dislocation from the First World War, there are actual crises, right? Crises in terms of nationalism, crises in terms of economics, definitely crises also in terms of identity,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Who we are as a people.
Or who we feel
Journey-
threatened by and
or
all
who
that,
we
yeah.
feel threatened by
Yeah.
too. But one of the things that I keep seeing is manufactured crises,
Yeah,
right? In other words, here's this problem.
right, right.
Here's these people, here's this problem. I'm the only one who can deal with it. And in other words, so you manufacture the crisis,
Right.
and then you come up with the answer.
I'll remind
and
you.
the crisis itself
yeah.
isn't actually real.
And I'll remind you of a historical figure, being a historian that you are, I'm sure you'll appreciate, Vladimir Lenin, right? He was waiting and waiting and waiting for the false consciousness of capitalism to emerge from Russia, and he just didn't have any time to wait anymore in his perspective. So take advantage of the crisis you have, or manufacture a worse crisis, right? So he started with Russia at the end of World War I, which would have been enough crisis for literally anything to be, right? Charismatic leader, dictatorship of the proletariat. We're going to rule until you all figure this all out, right? As we just don't have time. Oddly enough, we're almost 200 years from Marx writing the Communist Manifesto, and my friends on the left are still waiting for false consciousness to dissipate and the masses to understand and rise up and overthrow capitalism and all the things that Marx talks about. So sometimes I think what happens is the charismatic leader doesn't want to wait for the time, for the crisis to manufacture for transformation, right? And certainly with a totalitarian system, that'd be the case. Yes?
Speaking of crises, we could add another one with environmental crises and climate change, where it's creating more mass immigration movement, which then threatens the sense of identity and belonging in some of these nations.
Oh yeah, yeah, and it pushes migration because you've got droughts and you've got environmental refugees, people moving across borders because the places they used to live in are either uninhabitable from drought or no longer existing from sea level rise and a variety of things like that. And what a great scapegoat when those Maldivians, Maldivians, I don't know, that come and try to take over our country. You know, they'll be easy enough to pick off. You'll see them by their suntan. Whatever it happens to be, right? That becomes. So thank you, and thank you for correcting me, because now I sit in complete shame that I didn't think about environmental first, since that's all I ever talk about in my classes.
So I'm going to
Sure.
I'm going to try to keep from
Please.
getting in too deep here, because I feel like I might be in a minority here. But the mass migration crisis,
Mm-hmm.
do you think it was created by the globalists movement?
No, not necessarily. Mass migration, it is and it isn't, right? I mean, globalization is the free flow of goods and services around the world, and peoples as well. I mean, that's part of globalization. We sometimes like to only say we're only interested in the goods and services, we don't really want the people, but generally those things kind of go together. So as you weave your economies together, you can create that opportunity for people to move. You've also got, there's a significant number of people that in the last 80 years rose up out of poverty. It was really significant. And I think people that remind us of that, that's an important thing to keep in mind. Poverty went down in a lot of places around the world. There's still poverty in the world, but people move up, they move around, they do that sort of thing. What I think the challenge is, how do you respond to that influx of populations moving back and forth across your border? Do you see it and frame it as threatening, as the challenge that is why you're losing your job, why you can't buy your home anymore, why you can't understand languages spoken in a grocery store that you went to, that you used to always go to and never really be confronted by you being different from anybody, and now you hear these languages you don't know, and now you feel at a disadvantage, and you feel like you're losing things. And then I think a really clever charismatic leader, a clever propaganda campaign can take that alienation you feel from things you used to know and transform that into resentment, into hatred, and so forth. So you don't think so? Yeah.
The World Economic Forum sits there and is quite sophisticated in their strategies. And if a person spends some time studying them, they have some pretty very ambitious goals. And they don't think in terms of one country, they think in terms of the world, and they think in terms of using things like mass migration in their favor to break down nations, because they want to have a globalist thing. So I don't see mass migration as having happened spontaneously because of the environment. I think that has been a very clever ruse. I may not have anybody else. I could go on, but
No, fair enough. I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. Populations have moved around the globe for as long as there's been populations, right? No, maybe not this way. Certainly not in this number, but we haven't also had 8 billion people.
To be able to come to one country and just...
Sure. And you're moving around. It's economies of scale. There's a variety of elements of the global economy that would probably take us hours to sort through. Your point is not. I guess my argument is that they, at least from this, I'll go back to the textbook, right? To Hannah Arendt's book. She's not talking about globalization in the experience we've had since the peace. It hadn't happened, right? And so her book focuses on hyper-nationalism and the ways in which you create national identities to make that happen. But my argument would be, I think the book is still relevant because it both gives us an understanding of that and then allows us to begin to start playing with this. I think Arendt would be thrilled for us to have a much longer conversation about globalization and its role in this process, right? But globalization doesn't play out evenly, right? And part of it has to do with still these racial hierarchies that we have, that some parts of the world are less developed, less important, less understanding of what it really means to be able to be leaders, and so put it in the hands of the people who get it, right? And your natural inclination is to say, I want to be one of those people who get it. I don't want to be one of those people who doesn't get it. So I buy into that hierarchy, right? And put myself at that apex, whether I deserve it, whether I need it, whether it makes coherent sense, always it's about belonging. It's not about those arguments. So Point's well taken, though. But yeah, sure, I would love to engage that conversation further. One last question, because I know people want to be heading out.
The second sentence down, ground analysis and evidence and criteria developed by past studies and experience. It feels like that's not working. It feels like when you have evidence and when you have factual information, not being, people aren't absorbing that,
Mm-hmm.
pushing against it,
Mm-hmm.
which is part of that
Mm-hmm.
way of
Mm-hmm.
making
Well,
those people
yeah.
believe they don't know what they're doing. But
Yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to get is, because if the emotional brain is working and they're not absorbing those facts and all that, I mean,
Mhm.
I'm not
Sure.
sure, how is that gonna help us?
How do you get somebody back to
Right.
thinking they're with
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, I'll try to channel my best inner Arendt, and I would say a couple of things. First of all, maybe we're not doing it at the right scale. That is, maybe you're talking about these global trends when in reality they're operating on a very local level, right? So how do I talk to people about climate change? Now I'm going to get back to the environmental. How I talk to people about climate change is I talk to them about the impact on their crops right here in western Colorado right now, and I don't necessarily use the buzzword climate change. I talk about changing weather patterns. I talk about soil fertility. I talk about things they understand and they know. That's the grounding in evidence that I would use to bring them out of that, right? So if they're scapegoating people, you try to figure out if they've ever met those folks, and if not, part of the evidence is come meet somebody that is scapegoated. Let's journey together. And I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong to think of them as less than human. I'm going to invite you to experience somebody that you think of as less than human in a way that allows you to say, they're not so bad. We all put our pants on one leg at a time. They're not so bad. They worry about their kids too. They're really just worried about their future, and so am I. And so how am I so different than them, right? But if we go to the macro level, and we talk about all these global trends and all this sort of stuff, and we're always talking about national politics and only national politics, it's not grounded in a way that people will experience it. So I would say engage, right? Talk to them, but talk to them about things in their own lives, right? And if they scapegoat you, you still need to talk to them, right? Because, and I don't know you, but if I got to know you, I would bet within 10 minutes, we would be fast friends, right? We would figure out some mode of common ground, and that's the key. As long as you isolate so that I'm not anything like that person over there, or I'm not like you, then we are ripe for the picking. But we come together and say, no, I know Bob. And while Bob is quirky at times, I absolutely love this man. He's great. I could tell you 100 stories of Bob Murphy. Actually, Bob Murphy stories are some of the best stories I can tell, right? And even if he and I might not have originally seen eye to eye, and I don't know that we always talk about, like who are we voting for and all that sort of stuff, it doesn't really matter because Bob's a friend that I've known for 30 years, right? And I'm just not going to believe when you tell me that Bob is a horned devil, right? He's a lot of things, but he's not Satan, I'm pretty sure, most of the time, right? So, you know what I'm saying? Because now my evidence and my criteria is not there. So yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think when we're trying to talk about it in the macro level, it's super easy for us to lose sight of who the people are. When we get to the micro level, it's harder to do that. All right, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pause the conversation for anybody who planned on getting out of here at 8 o'clock. You clearly did not look at the bill that has Tim Casey talking. So if you need to leave, I very much appreciate and I'm honored and I want to honor your time. Those of you that would like to stick around for a little bit more conversation, I think we can still pay the light bill for a little bit longer, and I'd be happy to hear some more questions, to hear some more discussion, whatever, whether you want to do that individually or if you just want to stay in your seats after everybody clears out, we can have more discussion. But for those of you that came but did think you had a life outside of here that you wanted to go to at some point, again, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, forgive me. 2 slides away, right?
We have the room till
Questions? There you go. We have the room till 9. So before I let you go, though, apparently, Vince is reminding me, if you haven't seen it, this Field of Flags is powerful. We've been doing this, I should say we as CMU, not we as me, planting the flags, because Vince always gives me a hard time. I seem to always be busy on the Sunday he's putting flags out. Vince and several other volunteers put that flag out. It's out there in the main quad area of campus, and it's profound to me. Every time, 22 years later, I walk past it. When those flags are fluttering, it's a profound statement. You've seen Hannah Arendt, maybe too much of it. Tomorrow we have a huge keynote speaker. We're going to show a film as well as meet the daughter of the person of Ben Lesser who this film is about. I think are we videoing him into the conversation as well, Ben?
He's going to be here through Zoom.
Oh, he's going to be here through Zoom, okay,
Yeah.
and his daughter's here in person. So it's going to be a really special evening in Asteria Theater. If you don't know where that is, where have you been, people, for the last 9 months of Grand Junction? Transformative building in this town, I think. I would make that argument, and I'm not making it because I'm kissing up to CMU. I'm making it because I haven't seen so many plays and musicals and talks and films and concerts. It is transformative. And so here's another opportunity. On Wednesday, we've got Conspiracy. This is the one I was talking about with Colin Carmen, taking that 3rd book of Hannah Arendt's. We'll also talk about global history, and that's a professor of history and an endowed chair in Jewish history from CU Boulder, our friends from CU Boulder, who always come through giving us so much support and so much partnership to be able to bring speakers all the time. This is yet another one of those examples. We've got a professor of ours, instructor in anthropology, James Coburn, talking about Korean comfort women, to again push this series a little bit out. And then finally, Barry Laga, who is a perennial favorite in this. He has been with us also since the beginning, professor in language and literature department, talking about a graphic novel called Mouse, which addresses this issue of the Holocaust. And he'll talk about asceticizing. I said it right, maybe? I'll say it quick, and then it's fine. Okay. Anyway, lots of things to see. Super grateful to everyone who has supported this over the years. You support this by participating. You support this by donating, which is the cheap and shameless plug to point out the QR code here that allows you to snap and donate some more if you want to keep this sort of thing alive. But you really support this by continuing this conversation with people around. We cannot forget, and we still have work to do. So organize like the many fish that are chasing the big fish and make this a better space. All right? Break so you can all leave if you need to. Thank you very much.